Hearing will come to order. Mr. Aiken, the ranking member, is en route but got temporarily hung up, but he will be here shortly. He asked us so that we could go ahead and begin, and when he gets here, we'll give him an opportunity to do his opening statement also. Welcome to the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations hearing on Provincial Reconstruction Teams, PRTs, historical and current perspectives on doctrine and strategy. The subcommittee has conducted a series of hearings and briefings on the PRT programs in Afghanistan and Iraq to get a better understanding of what PRTs are, what they do, and the contribution that they are making in stabilizing Afghanistan and Iraq. And we've used this project as a case study of interagency operations. In order to emphasize the importance of interagency operations and to reinforce why our efforts here are so important, I'd like to quote the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Gates, from his recent remarks on the subject. Quote, "One of the most important lessons of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is that military success is not sufficient to win. Economic development, institution building, and the rule of law, promoting internal reconciliation, good governments, providing basic services to the people, training and equipping indigenous military and police forces, strategic communications, and more. These, along with security, are essential ingredients for long-term success. Accomplishing all of these tasks will be necessary to meet the diverse challenges I have described." And that's the end of quote of Secretary Gates. These imperatives cannot be accomplished by military alone. We need the capabilities of our entire government brought to bear in support of our current efforts. The purpose of today's hearing is to put our current efforts of stabilization and reconstruction in Iraq and Afghanistan into context, for as Secretary Gates says, quote, "Context is important," end quote. The nation has been here before. Throughout our history, we have experienced the difficulties of transitioning from the use of force to the task of rebuilding war-torn societies, from our own civil war to the hot and cold 20th century wars in Europe and the Far East, and smaller post-Cold War struggles such as in the Balkans and Haiti. Perhaps the campaigns which most closely resemble our current efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan are previous counterinsurgency efforts. In such cases, we engaged in armed insurgency while attempting to rebuild the physical and political structures of countries. Our goal has usually been a stable, peaceful, democratic, and independent nation-state friendly to the United States and its neighbors. Secretary Gates recently cited the Vietnam Accords efforts as an example, and again quoting Secretary Gates, quote, "However uncomfortable it may be to raise Vietnam all these years later, the history of that conflict is instructive. After first pursuing a strategy based on conventional military firepower, the United States shifted course and began a comprehensive, integrated program of pacification, civic action, and economic development. It had the effect of, in the words of General Creighton Abrams, putting all of us on one side, the enemy on the other. By the time U.S. troops were pulled out, the Corps program had helped pacify most of the hamlets in South Vietnam. The importance of deploying civilian expertise has been relearned the hard way through the efforts of staffed provincial reconstruction teams, first in Afghanistan and more recently in Iraq. The PRTs were designed to bring in civilians experienced in agriculture, governance, and other aspects of development to work with and alongside the military to improve the lives of the local population, a key tenet of any counterinsurgency effort." And that's the end of, again, Secretary Gates' quote. We hope that today's witnesses can help us gain a better understanding of and perspective on our efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have brought together practitioners and scholars who have experienced and or studied these previous and current campaigns in great detail. As always, we seek our witnesses' recommendations on what we should do, this Congress should do, to increase the likelihood of the success of our nation's efforts, both in the ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in the wars of the future. Our panel of witnesses today includes Mr. Is it Bernard or Bernard?
Bernard.
Bernard, also known as Bernie.
Bernie.
Carreau, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Technology and National Security Policy at the National Defense University. General Volney Warner, retired U.S. Army, President and Chief Executive Officer of V.F. Warner and Associates. And it's my understanding, General Warner, that your bride is with you today.
Yes, she is.
We'd like to acknowledge her presence here.
And oldest son.
And oldest son. Good for you. Brigadier General Rick Olson, U.S. Army retired, former commander of Combined Joint Task Force 76 in Afghanistan, and former director of the National Coordination Team in Iraq. And our fourth witness, Ms. Kathleen Hicks, senior fellow at the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We appreciate you all being here. Your written statements will, without objection, be made a part of the record. I also wanted to introduce a friend of mine and one of my constituents, Dr. Sharon Williams. Dr. Williams, if you don't mind standing up so folks can see you and wave and say hello. She's going to be just here with us a few minutes. She's from Little Rock, Arkansas, has a husband and family, and two lovely little girls back home. She spent 6 months in Afghanistan as a veterinarian with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. She's now has been 7 months as the Ministry Advisor for Animal Health and Food Safety at the United States Department of Agriculture in Baghdad. Has been there for 7 months, came home for Thanksgiving, spent time in Arkansas with her little girls and husband, and is now heading back tomorrow to complete her another 5 months in Iraq. Once we've finished with your all's opening statements, we will go to our 5-minute rule, and the members that were here at the gavel will go first, and then followed by other members as they come in. And I also ask, without objection, unanimous consent for Dr. Charles Bastani to participate in the hearing today after all the regular subcommittee members have finished. And we'll now go to Mr. Aiken for any comments he'd like to make.
Thank you, Dr. Schneider, and good afternoon to our witnesses. We appreciate your being here today. Today's hearing is this subcommittee's 5th public hearing on provincial reconstruction teams. Our witnesses will not only offer their perspective on the current PRT program, but will put these operations into a historic context. The only thing really new about PRTs is the name, the concept, how an interagency team comprised of civilian and military personnel works to extend the reach of the government into regional provinces and local areas comes with significant historical precedent. The most recent and commonly referenced analog to PRTs is the Civil Operations Revolutionary Development Support, or CORDS program the United States employed during Vietnam. The CORDS program was the interagency response to insurgency during the Vietnam War. Like the PRTs, CORDS teams are made up of civilian and military personnel. CORDS teams spread out to the 44 provinces and personnel at the provincial and district levels embedded with the local government officials. Most importantly and critical to our efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan is that many believe the CORDS fulfill the most fundamental mission of counterinsurgency. Proponents of this view believe the CORDS program increased the effectiveness of the local government and security forces by training 900,000 Vietnamese, including 300,000 civil servants. CORDS help establish the vitality of the South Vietnamese government by providing competitive services and local security. This marginalized the Viet Cong, and people no longer felt compelled to turn to the shadow communist regime. After the institution of CORDS, a Viet Cong colonel lamented, "Last year we could attack the United States forces. This year we find it difficult to attack even puppet forces. We failed to win the support of the people and keep them from moving back to enemy-controlled areas." This sentiment is exactly the type of thing we need to hear from al-Qaeda and Taliban operatives fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. Again, thank you all for being witnesses here today. We're very interested in what you have to say, and particularly the historic connect and what we should be learning from our experiences in the past. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Aiken. We will put this little clock on there, which I assume you can see from your side. Now, we'll put it on 5 minutes, but that's more just for your benefit to know when 5 minutes go by. If you have other things you want to get to, you feel free to ignore it when the red light comes on. Mr. Carreau, you're recognized. And we'll just go down the line to General Warner and then General Olson and Ms. Hicks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Snyder, Congressman Aiken, distinguished members, thank you for inviting me here today to discuss current and historical perspectives on PRTs. I'm honored to be here and with such distinguished fellow panelists. Today I want to talk briefly about civil military and interagency relations in Vietnam. Although the scale and historical circumstances of Vietnam differ greatly from those of Iraq and Afghanistan, some aspects of intergovernmental relations in Vietnam may offer valuable lessons for today. Like the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Vietnam was a war in which the United States was itself a belligerent as opposed to a third-party intervener. It was a war in which the United States suffered significant casualties and expended significant resources, and it was a war which had an enormous impact on our national security interests and domestic politics. Turning to the CORDS effort, pacifications efforts in Vietnam, what might today be called counterinsurgency or post-war stability operations, involved returning government control to a countryside that was infiltrated by Viet Cong insurgents. It focused on local security efforts, but also included distributing food and medical supplies, agriculture support, job creation, and land reform. The Civil Operations and Rural Development Support Program was created in 1967 after years of unsatisfactory attempts at coordinating the activities of multiple agencies under the U.S. Ambassador's country team. President Johnson appointed Robert Comer to the position of Deputy to General William Westmoreland, the commander of MACV. Robert Comer's nickname was Blowtorch Bob, to give you an idea of his forceful and no-nonsense personality. The deputy commander carried a 3-star rank. The union of the previously separate civilian and military pacification efforts into a combined CORDS program resulted in what may have been the only truly integrated civilian-military command in U.S. history. The integrated command placed civilians in charge of military personnel and vice versa. It also placed military resources, including logistics, transport, and force protection assets, at the disposal of civilians. Military and civilian units were co-located, often in the same building at the national, regional, province, and district levels. Comer developed a cordial relationship with Westmoreland, as did Comer's successor, William Colby, with Westmoreland's successor, General Creighton Abrams. In turn, Generals Westmoreland and Abrams showed great flexibility and allowed their civilian deputies considerable leeway in setting priorities and allocating resources. By placing almost all pacification-related programs under a single headquarters and investing the single manager with unprecedented access to resources, Comer had sufficient leverage to force the various agencies to develop and implement a nationwide pacification plan in conjunction with the South Vietnamese government. Much of the impetus for reorganizing CORDS came from President Johnson himself. Johnson viewed pacification in Vietnam as an extension of his vision for his domestic Great Society policies and began to describe the effort to help the Vietnamese people as the other war. I wanted to make just a couple of observations about the CORDS program and today's PRTs. Of course, the scale of the pacification effort in Vietnam dwarfed the PRT efforts in both Iraq and Afghanistan. For example, there were almost 8,000 U.S. participants in CORDS and as much as 800,000 South Vietnamese Army, National Police, and local government officials. All of this against a backdrop of about 500,000 U.S. troops and 400,000 South Vietnamese conventional forces. Compare this to Afghanistan, where there are approximately 30,000 coalition forces and about 3,000 personnel in the PRTs. There are more troops, of course, in Iraq, but there are fewer PRT personnel. But the lessons from CORDS have more to do with organizational structure. Many former participants from the United States Agency for International Development and the military talk about the surprising level of cooperation, large amounts of financial resources available for pacification projects in Vietnam. They talk about the symbiotic relationship. The military needed civilian expertise in local governance and job creation. The civilians needed the military protection, of course, and their expertise in counterinsurgency operations, and needed their lift and force protection abilities. One point I would make is compare the CORDS with the original structure in Iraq. In Iraq, originally under Orha, there was a retired 3-star general headed up who was appointed to head up the reconstruction efforts, separate from the military command, with no access to resources. No matter how competent, a retired 3-star cannot compete for resources and influence with an active duty 4-star general in charge of the entire operation. I wanted to make a couple of points also about non-traditional security assistance, which I know is on today's agenda and which my fellow panelists will talk more about. I want to draw a sharp distinction between stabilization, pacification, and counterinsurgency activities in a war zone and security cooperation arrangements and training equip activity and longer-term development activities in non-crisis countries. In my view, it is entirely appropriate for the military to have the lead on reconstruction activities in a war zone. The lesson of CORDS in Vietnam is that this structure works better than having a civilian lead. In Vietnam, pacification had priority over traditional development assistance, although in practice on the ground it was often hard to tell the difference between the two. Everyone agreed that security had to come before reconstruction. One example I would cite today as a contrast to that from Iraq is the example of state-owned enterprises. It's an issue I know well because when I was in Iraq with CPA, I was on detail from the Commerce Department, and that was my area was private sector development. There is still disagreement today between the State Department and the Department of Defense over whether to rehabilitate the state-owned enterprises or to privatize them. It is my view now, as it was when I was in Baghdad, that the state-owned enterprises should be rehabilitated where possible in a war zone to get people back to work and off the streets, even though, of course, this view is entirely contrary to traditional long-term development orthodoxy. So some final concluding remarks I would say is that unity of command in a war zone is essential, and I say that as a civilian and as a former civilian participant in one of these operations. In a major contingency such as Vietnam or Iraq, unity of command between military and civilian efforts, which brings along with it the enormous military resources, I think is an imperative element. I think there needs to be a mandatory control structure. The civil-military chain of command should be established at the very highest levels of the government, because without top-down direction, there will be intense organizational resistance to concession of control of agency assets to a unified interagency headquarters. There should be a focus on the local population, which CORDS incorporated. Counterinsurgency and stabilization activities require a focus on local populations and on understanding and fulfilling their needs. The focus in CORDS was on security first, then economic well-being. And the final point I would make is that in these types of activities in a war zone, we need to encourage host nation ownership. CORDS was designed to empower the South Vietnamese government to provide security and essential services to the districts and villages. In fact, the ratio of U.S. participants was about 1 to 1,000, U.S. to South Vietnamese participants. The final point I would make is that the lesson is to build the local private sector. CORDS was designed to build the agriculture and economic livelihoods of local villages and districts rather than as a temporary employment or one-time donor contribution. I will stop there. I thank the committee for the opportunity to appear before you today.
Thank you, Mr. Carreau. And before you begin, General Warner, I want to acknowledge the loss of your granddaughter, First Lieutenant Laura Margaret Walker, who died in combat in Afghanistan on August 18th, 2005. And we know that's been a tremendous sacrifice for your family. And you still have 6 other members who have served in the military, and we appreciate your service and service to your family. General Warner.
Thank you. Well, it's been over 25 years since I've been in this building, so I appreciate.
Looks about the same, don't it?
Yeah. There's still things in the hallways, I noticed that. But I'm honored to be here and have a chance to participate. And I was thinking on the way over, since I've not been to Afghanistan, I've not been to Iraq, that the reason for my appearance had to be my presentation given to the National War College. And I wanted to just, in my opening statement, just mention what that was. I think it's related to what happens next, really. And I believe the committee has been provided the notes on my presentation given to the National War College. And I titled the presentation, Getting Past Iraq, in that my greatest interest was to ensure that we come up with a better solution to assist future failed states where U.S. vital interests are involved without resorting to the deployment of conventional military force. The U.S. cannot resolve most of the instability in the world militarily. Winning all battles is not excellence. Excellence is achieving our goal without fighting, and the best way to win wars is to make them unnecessary. If there truly is to be a global Islamic movement and our enemies are extremists, non-state players using asymmetric, irregular warfare, if that's the case, then the nature of future conflict, which includes both hard and soft power, is more political than military. As such, we need to fashion a better interagency preemptive response. Let's call it counterinsurgency, commonly referred to as COIN. And how should we proceed? My thought would be that first, we need to put together an overarching national counterinsurgency plan to start the process. The national plan should be built from the bottom up by integrating those counterinsurgency plans as coordinated between the regional unified commanders, called SINCs in my day, changed somewhat recently, and their ambassador counterparts. Priority should be given to failed states, where a vital U.S. national interest is involved. The Congress should mandate and fund the soft power agencies of the U.S. government to enable them to perform their part of the interagency task to include, State Department, U.S. Agency for International Development, Central Intelligence Agency, and a new U.S. Information Agency, just to name a few. A new Department of Stability, co-equal to defense and state, in authority and funding, may be required to manage the effort at the national level under the watchful eye of a special assistant to the president. Having been under the watchful eye of Comer for about 2.5 years, I understand exactly what that means. If we could find a Comer clone somewhere in the United States, he would be a welcome special assistant to the president to bring the agencies on board in the Washington region and backstop the Petraeuses of the world and those who are out on the ground trying to get the job done. Once that would be established, the teams would be then trained. We could have a microcosm country team, PRTs in terms of Afghanistan and Iraq, should be trained and tailored country by country to support the forward deployed U.S. ambassadors and their military assistance advisory group staffs, MAGs, which were greatly reduced in 1973 and should once again be augmented so that they can actually do the job required of them in the countries they find themselves. And certainly in working with the local populations in counterinsurgency efforts at the province level. Secure, hold, and build is a good paradigm. It's very descriptive of the team activities once deployed. As we've just heard, that's exactly what happened in Vietnam. The objective should be not to impose our political and economic ideals on the locals, but to devise and fund plans supportive of both their and our interest in the region. Only when it appears that an advisory effort has failed will the President be faced with the critical decision of whether to deploy conventional military force or withdraw support or seek multilateral support. I thank you for letting me make that pitch.
Thank you, General Warner. General Olson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thanks to the members. I think the order that we're speaking is fortuitous because we've got a good introduction to the historical context. I'm going to talk a little bit about history that's more recent, and then Ms. Hicks will talk a little bit about policy, I'm sure, since she's got a good background in that. My association with PRTs began in Afghanistan, where I served, as the chairman said, as a CJDF commander there, responsible for all U.S. military operations, and as such, I also ran the PRTs. In Afghanistan, PRTs are run by the military, not the case in Iraq. And then in August 2006, as an official of the Department of State, I became the Deputy Director of the Iraqi Reconstruction Management Office and the Director of the National Coordination Team. So as a State Department official, I ran all the PRTs in Iraq. Very different effects there, and we could talk about that more later on if you'd like to. PRTs in Afghanistan, first established by Ambassador Khalilzad. The first one was in Gardez province in 2003, about 50 miles south of Kabul. The purpose of these organizations, and all PRTs are civil military, as you are well aware, was to serve as the primary interface between the coalition and Afghan provincial and local governments, not the national government, but provincial and local governments, and to assist them to govern their provinces more effectively and deliver essential services to the people. PRTs in Afghanistan were commanded by military officers, not the case in Iraq. In Iraq, they aren't PRT commanders, they are PRT leaders. And there's a difference that produces a difference as well. And the PRTs in Afghanistan were initially manned primarily or staffed primarily by military personnel, overwhelmingly by military personnel. Later on, State Department and USAID officials entered the fray. The PRT program in Iraq was instituted in November 2005. Again, Ambassador Khalilzad is the one who brought it on board. By that time, he had moved from Afghanistan to Iraq. And the first PRTs there were opened up in Mosul, Kirkuk, and then later on in Baghdad, and eventually 10 PRTs. And that's how many standing PRTs there are now. There are now 25 PRTs in total. There are really three types of PRT. There are the standing PRTs, which are located within the provinces where they operate. There are 10 of those in Iraq and about 25. All the ones in Afghanistan are standing PRTs. The next is what's known as a Provincial Support Team. They exist in Iraq, not in Afghanistan, but these are small civil military teams that are located outside of the province in which they are supposed to operate and go back and forth into the province from some type of hub PRT. Normally, you'll see a PST in an area that doesn't support, from a security standpoint, the actual establishment of a PRT in that province. And then there's what's known as the embedded PRT. Those were started early this year in Iraq. Those PRTs are actually embedded in brigade combat teams, and those PRTs work for the brigade commander, very similar to the Corps' concept as I understand it. I'd like to very quickly go over some of the accomplishments, if you will, the successes of the PRTs, and then areas where they have fallen short or where they've been challenged. First area is provincial and local governments, both Afghanistan and Iraq, are functioning. They may not be what we would all recognize as the paragon of good governance, but they are up and they're functioning in each one of the provinces, and that was not the case before the PRTs were stood up. There are reconstruction projects that the PRTs have started that are having an effect and are actually making a difference in the lives of the people. Third, microloans and micro grants channeled through provincial reconstruction teams are having a salutary economic effect. So economic development is occurring as a direct result of the work that PRTs are doing. PRTs have contributed to the reconciliation process. This Sunni awakening in Anbar province was in many ways facilitated by the PRT, and then later on the embedded PRTs located in Anbar. Right now there are 4 PRT organizations in Anbar, and they are helping with the reconciliation process. And then finally, cooperation and coordination between provincial and national governments has been improved through the efforts of PRTs. PRTs have been directly involved in taking, take Iraq for example, taking Iraqi officials to Baghdad and in some cases introducing governors to their ministers. And that's through the efforts of PRTs working with the military located in those provinces. So very quickly, some challenges. Obviously, the demands of geography in both countries exceed the reach of the PRTs, and the PRTs are not resourced with transportation assets to enable them to get out and really reach into the provinces in some of the more remote areas. Plus, especially in Afghanistan, the geography is very, very tough, and it's hard to travel in there. In some of the more unstable provinces of Afghanistan and Iraq, security restrictions have hindered the ability of PRTs to do their business. My personal opinion, some of those restrictions are artificial. There are civilians who are subject to much more restrictive security requirements than the military are. That only makes it difficult for PRTs to operate, but it also engenders some hard feelings between the civilian and the military elements in the PRT. There's no established proponency for PRTs. Nobody really owns them. The Department of Defense doesn't own them. The Department of State doesn't really own them. And the PRT concept has no godfather. And then finally, considerable lip service notwithstanding, PRTs are not a resourcing priority for the agencies tasked to support them. We had some real difficulties in both Afghanistan and in Iraq getting people to man positions in the PRTs, especially from some of the civilian agencies. In conclusion, despite the significant challenges being faced by PRT members, a lot of brave men and women who are out there on the ground making a difference. I think that the value added by PRTs to the operations both in Iraq and Afghanistan has been understated and I think under-recognized. I also think that PRTs, and the colleagues to my right here talked about civil-military cooperation at the national level. I think PRTs can serve as a good model. There are good lessons learned from PRTs that can be applied to civil-military relations at other levels. I thank the committee. I'm sorry to run a little bit late.
Ms. Hicks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the Defense Department's evolving role in delivering security and humanitarian assistance. Over the past year, my colleague, Stephen Morrison, and I have co-directed a pretty unique task force on non-traditional security assistance that sought to understand the evolution of DoD's role and its international and interagency dynamics. This task force is co-led by your colleagues, Representatives Robert Andrews and Mark Kirk, and it formed from a simple yet surprisingly unusual concept to bring together experts from the defense, diplomacy, and development sectors to examine military and civilian roles in new U.S. security assistance and development. As you might imagine, these stakeholders brought a wide range of experience and expertise to the problem set. The task force's recommendations, which are scheduled to be released later this month, reflect a strong majority viewpoint that spans across each of these sometimes divided domains. Since the terrorist attacks of September 11th, the U.S. concept and approach to global security has changed fundamentally. Weak and failing states, long neglected, have risen in priority. We understand that threats to the United States can emanate from within states with which the United States is not at war, and importantly, that persistent poverty can be a significant contributor to those threats. There's now a strategic imperative to devise multi-decade integrated approaches that are preventative in nature. And foundational to this preventative approach is sustainable overseas partnerships that build capacity for good governance and security, foster economic prosperity and social well-being, and more effectively promote community-led development. Accordingly, we now place a far higher premium on the unity of effort of our foreign and national security policy instruments, especially defense, diplomacy, and development. Provisional Reconstruction teams are emblematic of this trend. In just a few short years, the Pentagon's role as a direct provider of foreign assistance has surged. From 2002 to 2005, DoD's share of U.S. official development assistance increased from 5.6% to 21.7%. The Defense Department has assumed an expanding role in counterterrorism, capacity building, post-conflict operations, and humanitarian relief. Beyond implementing traditional military-to-military programs supported by State Department funds, DoD has been granted temporary authorities to use directly appropriated funds both for prevention and post-conflict response, concentrated in conflict-ridden, non-permissive environments where civilian actors have difficulty operating or where civilian capacities are weak or absent. DoD has also provided billions of reimbursement dollars to coalition members such as Pakistan and Jordan outside of the formal State Department-run economic support funds process. Meanwhile, the United States has continued to under-resource the diplomatic and development instruments of national power. As all the other panelists have pointed out, the staffing programs and operational capacities of the U.S. Agency for International Development and the State Department have continued to stagnate at the very moment in history when diplomatic and development agencies should be better, not less well-positioned, to advance the United States' new evolving global agenda. By defaulting to reliance on the military, the United States is aggravating these existing institutional imbalances. Compelling reasons exist, as Bernie pointed out, to give DoD flexibility to provide foreign assistance in specific circumscribed crisis situations. Granting more permanent global authorities, however, does not address the larger structural problem and must be handled carefully, as it risks undermining both sustainable capacity building and broader U.S. foreign policy interests. To unify the U.S. government's approach to security and development assistance, the task force intends to make the following 4 major recommendations. First, the executive branch must provide increased budget transparency to Congress in the form of an integrated resource picture of U.S. foreign, national, and homeland security policy. Wholesale revision of the existing congressional authorization and appropriation structure would require bold leadership and near unanimous support in Congress, conditions that I do not believe will obtain in the near future. Nevertheless, OMB and the NSC should be required to document more systematically how the foreign assistance streams for aid, state, DoD, and other relevant U.S. agencies fit together. Such transparency would help provide an accurate portrait to Congress of what the United States is actually spending across agencies to meet its most pressing national security challenges, as well as facilitate the creation of benchmarks to assess progress in meeting these objectives through various instruments of national power. Second, Congress should take steps to ensure more effective and comprehensive oversight of foreign and security assistance programs that cross existing committee jurisdictions. One potential solution set much discussed is the creation of a select committee on U.S. national security in the Senate and the House, but simply improving coordination processes across existing committees might also bear fruit. Third, both Congress and the executive need to elevate the priority attached to development, placing it on an equal footing with defense and diplomacy in U.S. foreign and national security policy. To this end, the task force is going to call for a significant increase in U.S. official development assistance and for better integration, again, of the multiple streams of development aid. Finally, to improve the performance of civilian agencies in conflict prevention and post-conflict response, the task force will be recommending that the next administration appoint an NSC Senior Director for Conflict Prevention and Response to serve as a locus of interagency coordination on these issues at the White House level and work in close concert with OMB. At the same time, the State Department Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, SCRS, should be empowered with a larger multi-year funding stream so that it may lead contingency planning for the State Department and USAID in support of the NSC's coordinating efforts. Congress should move now to fund SCRS's plans for improving civilian response capacity, including its Rapid Response Corps and Civilian Reserve Corps, and Congress and the White House should expand the expeditionary capabilities of other civilian agencies, particularly USAID. Before closing, I'd like to very briefly review the task force's recommendations with respect to PRTs. PRTs are a potentially promising platform for integrating civilian and military instruments working in unique and difficult operational environments. At the same time, PRTs suffer from important limitations, many of which have been described to you today or in previous hearings, and we largely echo those. To maximize the potential of PRTs, the task force intends to make the following recommendations. Advise the NSC to initiate a government-wide process to clarify PRT mandate and doctrine, including agency roles and ownership. Recommend that DoD and its civilian partners conduct more comprehensive strategic planning for the use of PRTs and create baseline assessments to identify the needs these teams should be addressing. Recommend expanding pre-deployment training of these interagency teams and other interagency teams. Endorses streamlining of USAID funds in post-conflict settings. AIDS quick impact project funding is a good start, but it's insufficient, and many other resourcing streams exist that must be integrated. Call for greater monitoring and evaluation of the impact of PRT projects, including from security, governance, and development perspectives. Advocate the development of robust civilian response reserve corps as a human capital base for future civilian military teams, and providing them again with attendant training and participation incentives. And welcoming the recent DoD agreement with NGOs on rules of the road to guide their interaction in insecure environments. I want to conclude by restating what I'm sure everyone in this room believes. Meeting the security challenges of the 21st century requires the United States to marshal the full range of instruments of national power and influence, creating a whole-of-government approach and requiring the executive branch to explain how its budgets and programs support a unified national security and foreign aid strategy will substantially improve the nation's ability to address the structural roots of poor governance, instability, and extremism in the developing world. Thank you.
Thank you all for your testimony. We've also been joined by Dave Loebsack, who's a member of the full committee, and without objection will be allowed to participate after the other members of the subcommittee have asked their questions. Goodbye, Dr. Williams. Good luck to you. See you in Arkansas. By the way, she was nodding in response to some of the things you all were saying about PRT. You know, this subcommittee, this Oversight Investigation Subcommittee, is in a bit of a peculiar situation because we really have had a lot of control over what we could look at. And, you know, when people talk about oversight or investigations, we can think about contracts and cost overruns and all those kinds of things. But there has been a lot of enthusiasm on both sides of the aisle in this subcommittee at looking at the issue of what's going on the civilian side of our government. Because in many ways we see that as maybe the key to our success today in Iraq and Afghanistan, and success in the future in other wars. And I'm going to, I guess, carry that point to the extreme here, General Warner, in the written statement that we have from you, which I think was part of the text of your previous speech that you referred to. You talk about the need to have, quote, a vastly empowered, funded, and resourced State Department. Not Defense Department, but State Department that only the Congress can mandate and make happen, was the end of your quote. And then Ms. Hicks, on page 1 of your statement, you say, meanwhile, the United States has continued to under-resource the diplomatic and development instruments of its national power. The staffing programs and operational capacities of the U.S. Agency for International Development and the U.S. Department of State have continued to stagnate at the very moment in history when diplomatic and development agencies should be better, not less well positioned to advance the United States' new evolving global agenda. And then on page 6, Ms. Hicks, of your statement, you asked perhaps the key question of this, how realistic, quoting you, how realistic is it to expect that robust civilian capacities will actually emerge and be funded? End of your quote, and you discussed that a little bit. And I think that issue of, we've been spending quite a bit of time on how that relationship between the DOD and the military and the civilian side should work. I would think that the answer to your question is if we come up with a model that seems to point in the right direction, that we will greatly enhance our ability to get it funded and operational, because I think there's really a lot of concern about where we're going. I wanted to ask one preliminary question, perhaps starting with General Warner and General Olson, then any comments the other two. You need to start the clock on me here, so I'm sorry. Comments the other two want to make. Take a step back and look just at the military side. The troops that we have in the military today that we're sending to Iraq and Afghanistan, and knowing of the work that they're doing, the ones that are in an almost daily basis are dealing with with Iraqi and Afghan civilians. Is there more that we could or should be doing to prepare them for success and prepare them to avoid mistakes? I'm thinking of language skills, culture skills, those kinds of things. What should we actually be looking at with regard to our troops on the ground, the boots on the ground guys that are really involved in the fighting side of it? Should we be doing more with an eye towards these other goals that we have? General Warner, I want to start with you.
I think the troop increase that's forecast and the existing capability of special forces, rangers, civil affairs, civic action, PSYWAR, the Army soft power components, if you will, are fairly well attuned to the what they need to do is their military input to what we've been talking about today. And I think with the personnel increase, that some of those, be they go to special forces or elsewhere, will be able to do that. I think a return, though, back to where we were 15, 20 years ago, where we had certain people dual tracked within the military that basically could pop in and out of military assistance advisory groups, be immersed in a particular region, have regional orientation, and also have language training, that you eventually then build a cadre of people that you can call on when needed to go to Bogota or go to Lisbon or somewhere else and be used, rather than wait until you have the problem and then suddenly say, well, we don't speak the language, nobody's been there in 25 years. So there are things that can be done. Just from what I've heard the military say in recent days, I believe that's fairly underway. I don't worry about the military's capacity to respond to what's required of them in this issue. I worry a great deal about the civilian side as well. And the fact that the civilian side has a tendency, as they did in Vietnam, to go mufti, borrow Army, put them in civilian clothes, and then perform their mission. That's not a good long-term solution to the problem.
General Olson, any comments?
Yeah, thank you. I think you got to break the answer to that question down into short-term and long-term. And if we're concerned about what we can do right now, I don't think there's a lot of programmatic help. I agree with General Warner. There's not a whole lot of programmatic help that they need right now, but I would like to highlight really three things. First of all, the military is starting to integrate in a big way into their mission rehearsal exercises the integration of soft power with their kinetic operations, and that needs to be encouraged and probably expanded. The second thing that and I'm not familiar with how far this has gone, but a good lessons learned process that takes the lessons that are being learned in Afghanistan and Iraq right now about dealing with civilians and then shares that, especially with the units that are going over there, I think is important. And then I'm going to underscore what General Warner said. I think there's work that can be done right now to train key civilian personnel who are going to Iraq and Afghanistan, who are going to work with the military, to train them and indoctrinate them about military culture, processes, systems, and that kind of thing. Just the planning process, I think, is a great example of that. Longer term, and I won't go on too much about this, but there are organizational issues. I think especially ground force formations could be modified to let's say, capitalize on the potential of the integration of military and civilian efforts. It has to do with the manning of headquarters, for example, and at lower levels as well. And then there's some real institutional issues that I think need to be addressed, and that's how do we build into the professional development system and the military education system enough of the impact of soft power. Are we doing that enough? And I think there's certainly room to improve in those areas. So those would be my comments.
My time's about up, but Ms. Hicks, do you have any comment, or Mr. Carreau?
I just wanted to follow up a little bit on what General Olson just said. I totally agree. I think that the civilians need to glom on to some of the military structures and capabilities. I think one of the secrets of the CORDS program is that the civilians joined in on existing military structures because they're much larger, they were better resourced, and also they do operational things that most civilian agencies don't know how to do, like planning and training. So I think that that sort of thing, as General Olson was saying, I think would be extremely important. I think you need cross-pollination on both sides, but I think that would be very helpful for the civilian agency.
Thank you. Mr. Aiken for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just sort of backing up a little bit to the experience in Vietnam, which is of interest of some of us oldsters that are kicking around here. Did these reconstruction teams do some good? Apparently, from your testimony, they were doing some good. If they were doing good, why do we end up where we were? Were we in the right track and gave up too soon, or is that the bottom line?
I think it's a difficult question to answer, and historians will argue over this. I think what the consensus seems to be is that the program itself, the Corps program itself, achieved its limited objectives, but the patient still died anyway. But remember, Corps was set up to defeat the Viet Cong infrastructure, so it was really about local insurgents who were extracting rents and taxes and land and grown goods from the local people. The idea was to win over the hearts and minds of those people. It was never intended to defeat the North Vietnamese, the conventional army. So what ultimately happened was it was a combination of the Tet counteroffensive and a lot of the Corps programs in all the little villages that pretty much was fairly effective in defeating the Viet Cong insurgency, but it did not stop, the North Vietnamese conventional army from invading the South.
I guess the other question I had was, my understanding was that there's quite a lot of difference between the way these teams work in Afghanistan and Iraq. What's your impression about what we're doing? Should they be operating the same in both, or are the situations different enough that they need to be different in the way that they're focused? And last of all, if you're trying to build depth, which is always hard for us politically to try to plan more than just what dinner is going to be tonight, let alone what language skills we're going to need 5 years or 10 years down the path. How would that best be funded, politically and logically? Where would that repository? I remember back in the Vietnam days, my friend was in the Green Berets, and they were getting cross-trained in Czechoslovakian language, and how to fix a dog that had his leg shot off and all kinds of different things. So you had people that were cross-trained to do a lot of different things. I assume that was pretty expensive, and to be well prepared in terms of PRTs would probably be an expensive commitment as well. So just a few thoughts on those subjects. Thank you.
I could take a shot at the first part of the question about Afghanistan compared to Iraq. The answer is yes, they are different. I think the fundamental purposes, it starts right there, are different, and I think that's appropriate. The purposes are tied to the respective missions, and they are different. In Afghanistan, the purpose of those PRTs is more directly linked to the counterinsurgency effort, to winning hearts and minds, to use that term. Some people are reluctant to use it. I think it's a good term. And so what their focus is on is short-term, high-impact, high-visibility actions and activities and projects directly in support of a military commander. In Iraq, the purpose is a little bit different. It's a little bit longer term, and the purpose of the PRTs in Iraq is to, very broadly, is to accomplish capacity building, to rebuild, in many cases, institutions that will endure over a longer period of time.
Functional euphemism for rebuilding local government, or do
yes,
you mean something beyond that?
It means local government. It means rule of law. There's actually 5 pillars, but local government, rule of law, economic development. There's one other I'm forgetting, and then public diplomacy. The infrastructure, reconstruction of the infrastructure.
But in Iraq, we're not having road builders and sewer builders and stuff like that in our PRTs, are we?
No, but we're having experts who can advise where to go to contract for a road builder. We've got experts who can advise how a government should determine that there's a requirement for a sewage treatment plant. So it is a little bit more on the side of the institution building, the longer term, and a little bit less focused on the short term, directly tied to counterinsurgency, though there's obviously some slop over. Last point I would make is that the embedded PRTs are a little bit different in Iraq. They are, in fact, working directly for a brigade combat team commander, and they are focused on his counterinsurgency efforts, and they're also very, very successful.
Thank you. Mrs. Davis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of you for being here. I wonder if we could just turn for a second to the international effort, because I had an opportunity over the break to speak with some of our NATO counterparts, and there was certainly a lot of frustration about the fact that we really aren't doing a lot of sharing of information nor necessarily learning from one another of the PRT operations. And I wondered if you could speak to that. I think there's maybe at the higher levels there's some discussion, but there didn't seem to be, at least it wasn't getting down to the folks that are really doing the work. How should we be organizing that? And even if we did, I mean, is that important? I mean, is that something that we ought to be looking at if we're engaged in this kind of effort with our partners?
First, to talk about Iraq, where my most recent experience is there are two coalition PRTs from Europe. One is supported by Italy, the other which is in Dakar, and then the United Kingdom, which is in Basra. I think there what you would find is that you're always going to find the one PRT member who's got a complaint along those lines. But there I think you'd find there is sharing of information, cross-pollination, because there is an organization there, it used to be called the National Coordination Team, it's now the Office of Provincial Affairs, that is specifically designed to coordinate the efforts of all PRTs, to include the coalition PRTs. In Afghanistan, at least while I was there as the CJTF commander, there was no like organization that was specifically focused on running PRTs. It was a chain of command function.
We were focusing mostly on Afghanistan.
Okay.
On Afghanistan.
Then, and I'm not 100% current there, but I'll speak for when I was there. There was no organization that was focused on PRTs and coordinating their efforts. It was a chain of command function. And as you know, in Afghanistan, the chain of command is very busy. They're focused on a lot of different things.
Is that something that we should be at least trying to address and understand how we can best pull that
I think so. I think an organizational improvement would be in operations like this to have a separate I'll say headquarters, military terms, that they're specifically focused on coordinating the efforts and supporting PRTs. That seemed to work pretty well in Iraq. In Afghanistan, we didn't have it, and I will admit to you frankly that as a CJTF commander, at times the PRTs were kind of an afterthought.
Yeah. Because I think why this should be important is partly in moving public opinion and getting helping to see that this is an effort that is succeeding in some ways and an effort that is
Right.
that is important. You know, what strikes me, Ms. Hicks, as well, is that there are a lot of us who've had an interest in trying to pursue this question. I mean, and there are a lot of efforts actually going on. I actually didn't know about the task force, and we've talked about trying to do a different number of different things, really, to bring just members of Congress up to speed and into the fold, so that we might even see our committees as having more of an interagency focus, if you will, across jurisdictions and understanding. And I think what I always come back to in some ways is, you know, why aren't we getting this? Why is it really taking us a while to get to the point of seeing that the investment, certainly in this interagency work, is so important? And I'm just wondering if you could, you know, why is that? Why are we struggling with this so much?
Do you have thoughts on that? My view is that if you look around this
Ms. Hicks, pull that microphone a little bit closer to you, if you would, please.
My view is that if you look around this room, you see obviously a lot of people who've spoken today, and I know a lot of you on this committee are involved in this interagency working group up here on the House side. But most people are coming at it from a defense perspective, and it's very ironic in some ways that it's the defense community, the well-resourced, large defense community that feels most passionately really about this issue of interagency reform. And that is not to say there aren't parts of the civilian agencies that feel similarly, but I don't think it's organic there the way it is in the defense side. And that's a real hurdle to overcome. I think, I won't say you can't have reform without it. I think that would be too pessimistic. But I think you need to have state and AID, state in particular, start to feel, again, organically within their own organization that things have got to change. And without that, you don't have really willing recipients. On the civilian side, where a lot of the change is harder to come by, they've got a harder resourcing battle to make, and they've got no constituency throughout the United States the way the defense community does. So I think it will be difficult, but important.
We will go to Mr. Seastack, and that will conclude the folks who are here at the gavel, and then we'll go to Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Seastack for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. If I could maybe give an observation and ask your opinion on it, starting with you, Ms. Hicks. To some degree, I've always been taken that the military has forces, and then there's military force. Military force we use in war. Military forces have been used at times from intelligence to logistics to help humanitarian or other efforts. And as I've listened, or if I haven't been here, at least perused testimony in this issue over time, I've begun to kind of slightly change my mind about as we move to an interagency process on this. Particularly as I think about that, oftentimes these types of what you call in the military generals phase 4 operations often come about at the end of a conflict where strife is still present or of concern. And as I step back, and with all due respect to the Army generals, is there potentially a different model we might pursue where, much like the Marine Corps is supposed to be light, fast, quicks, in there, kick open the door, and then the Army with its heft comes in, might we not accept the cold brutal reality of the facts that DOD has forces because they're so well resourced, and accept that the, quote, PRTs that maybe initially help to stabilize or do things should be built around DOD. They're often there in strife where we need these, we just don't calmly or quickly walk into these countries sometimes. And that really the interagency process is one where it's the Army, so to speak, coming in afterwards, built around not trying to have them there initially. Maybe it is the National Guard with a bunch of farmers that initially start moving them towards something. Because I'm struck, Ms. Hicks, by saying we don't have any interagency doctrine. We need to institutionalize this. There's lack of resources. Maybe that's okay, much like we don't tend to live by our doctrines in the military anyway, as the Russians always told us. But my question is, maybe would that potentially be a different model to look at rather than this wonderful interagency thing that's supposed to come in, that maybe it is this quick core, presently built around DOD, and then there should be a natural transition, ready to go, but kind of comes in rather than forcing this in an unknown strife warrant situation.
I definitely think the right model is that you, in the early stages of a conflict, as the security environment is difficult, you are going to have it be military-led, and I think there's wide recognition that that's the way you have to go at the problem, and then transition into a civilian-led. And of course, I defer to my military colleagues on how they sense the time is right to make that transition. But having said that, I think it's very important not to lose sight of the idea that the military is not always the right face. It's not, even if you said, well, we want to build all the right skills into the military. We're going to focus on the military, give them all the right skill sets, which is a good thing to do. The problem is if you then come to rely on the military as your instrument, that's not the face of development and foreign policy that other countries or other individuals in countries, populations, want to see in their nation. And it alters the way our foreign policy then is presented overseas.
But for that quick, rapid opening, like the tsunami report, our military probably got better play and I saw all and purposely went to see the foreign press and gave more of a positive face to our military than we garnered in Iraq. I mean, so I understand the long-term implications, what you're saying, but I'm talking about opening that door.
Completely agree that in our task force report, as an example, we look at humanitarian assistance as one of our core issue areas, and we end up strongly endorsing the way in which we currently have a civil-military division of labor, for lack of a better term, on humanitarian assistance. The military can get there faster often. They can bring resources to bear, and that's a good thing. It's a great public diplomacy approach. It's a great true humanitarian effort. But in the long run, when you have to transition that into sustainable development, that's not where the Department of Defense is A, trained, or B, necessarily the face you want to put forward.
General comment?
I would say that I agree with what Ms. Hicks said, but I also think that if in fact the type of missions that you're talking about are going to become core missions for the military, that's going to require some first of all, culture changes. You know, there is a real controversy in the military. I don't speak for the military, but there's a controversy about whether or not, you know, whether we do windows, do we do nation building, and you know, even in the opening phases, some of these things can amount to nation building. So if in fact the military buys into that, then there are going to be organizational changes they're going to need to make, and there's definitely some resistance, as this committee is probably well aware, and then it flows from there. Doctrinal changes, professional military education changes, equipment changes, and on and on. So, though I might agree that this is a good approach, to do this across the military would take some effort.
Mr. Bartlett for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony. A day or two ago, I was reading a reprint, an early bird of an op-ed piece, I forget in which newspaper it appeared, which said that Iraq was the third most corrupt, I forget whether it said country or government in the world. When I read something like that, I'm always curious, who in the heck is number 1 and 2? Do you know?
You may not want to know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I do want to know the answer to that question. Who's number 1 and 2? They said that like everybody ought to know, and I thought, gee, maybe I just wasn't on the know on this thing. Who do you think they might have had in mind as number 1 and 2 as the most corrupt countries or government in the world?
Imagine Russia is up.
Russia is, okay, and who else?
Somalia might be up there.
Who? Somalia and Russia, okay. Yeah, I will check to see if that's what they had in mind. They said that a third of all of the money in our grants and contracts in Iraq just disappear or are stolen. That's about right?
My current position is working as the Chief Staff for the Special Inspector General for Iraqi Reconstruction. I'm not here in that capacity, but just based on my general knowledge, that is probably a good figure. It's a very hard figure to estimate, but about a third is probably not overstating the problem.
It just disappears or is stolen. Do we have an opportunity to help them understand that that this is not productive, that at the end of the day they'll be better off if they can somehow control this? Or do we just have to accept this as a part of the cost of doing this kind of business?
I think some of it is the cost of doing business in an area where there are tremendous security challenges and where you've got a government that is not transparent, that is developing, actually being built in some cases. But some of it must be addressed. I think Prime Minister Maliki has made that one of his top priorities. He calls that the second war. His is the war against graft and corruption. There are organizations, the Board of Supreme Audit inside of the Iraqi government, that is specifically focused on graft and corruption. So the problem is recognized. It's debatable whether or not the recognition translates to actual action.
Help me understand the reason for this problem. In many countries in the world, we have a lot of corruption simply because they don't pay their public officials enough, and if they're going to feed their family, they got to be blackmailing people and so forth. Is that the case here, or are these is this just a way of life in that country, that's if you have a job, that's what you do, you steal and so forth?
The Iraqi government has a remarkable record in terms of budget execution. It's remarkable because of how poor it is. One thing they can execute, however, is their operating budget. In other words, they pay salaries very well. So I don't think it's a case of government officials who are starving on the streets. I do believe that there are government officials in fairly high positions who are corrupt and on the take. They have been historically in Iraq, and I believe that continues to be a problem. And then some of the money disappearing is not necessarily disappearing into Iraqi pockets. As you well know, Congressman, there's ample evidence about corruption and fraud, waste, and abuse that's attributable to international entities that are working in Iraq, some of which are American.
I'm concerned that we not be seen as a supporter or facilitator of this kind of thing. Is this such an ingrained practice in their country that is probably inevitable, and there's darn little we can do about it unless we plan to stay there for 50 or 100 years?
I think you'd get varying answers to that question. There are differences of opinions. I am an optimist, and I think that the more developed the Iraqi government becomes, the more they are supported by the Iraqi people, the more transparent they become, and the more measures that are put into place to ensure that they're transparent, I think that the graft and corruption problem gets better, though let's face it, they are a third world nation, and graft and corruption are a sad fact of life in virtually all third world nations.
I thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. We'll now go to our two representatives who are not a member of the subcommittee in the order in which they came, and Dr. Bustani is recognized for 5 minutes, and then we'll go to Mr. Lopesac.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you extending the courtesies to me, and I want to commend you on this hearing. This was an excellent hearing. This whole issue of post-conflict stabilization is something I developed an interest in about 2 years ago. I've been reading extensively on it, books and papers by Council on Foreign Relations, some work done by General Nash, General Rupert Smith's recent book, The Utility of Force, where he talks about deployment versus employment of force. And what's remarkable as I go through this, I remember reading Churchill's first book in the 1890s where he described his deployment in the Swat Valley, where we're currently seeing problems, and he decried the lack of political expertise on the ground to complement the military expertise, and that they were constantly trying to quell these rebellions, but yet they couldn't get long-term stability because of the lack of a civilian political component. And here we are, we fast forward, and we see a State Department that has 6.5% of the funding that the Department of Defense has. We have currently about 6,000 Foreign Service officers worldwide, which puts us about on par with the United Kingdom today, and yet we're a superpower. And Mr. Carreau's testimony indicated we had 8,000 personnel in Vietnam alone. So we don't seem to learn from history what we should be doing. This testimony was excellent, and I think the order of testimony was just perfect as well. And you pointed out many things that we need to do, and from my reading, what you've pointed out today corroborates everything I've read, and it's astounding to me that there's all this information out there in the think tank community, yet Congress is not acting, and our administration has not really worked in that regard as well. And so clearly we've got problems in Congress with stovepiping our committee structure and so forth, which, Ms. Hicks, you offered some recommendations which I think are excellent. One of the things that strikes me, I spoke with Barbara Stevenson starting back in December about the PRTs in Iraq, and I've been talking to her on a regular basis about how's it going with the different phases, and particularly phase 3 with the backfill has been very difficult in mobilizing the civilian component and having a reserve force. So this is clearly something that you all addressed, and it's something that needs to be looked at. One question I have for the panel would be, instead of trying to put together ad hoc PRTs, should we have PRTs or some sort of equivalent put into place that participate in the scenario planning, contingency planning, so that we don't get into certain difficulties late into the crisis, and that we avert a crisis with that type of expertise and planning and so forth. And I'd open it up to the panel for their comment.
I'll start. I think from what I understand of what Ambassador Hurst is attempting to do at SCRS, that's exactly the plan. And they will require the Department of Defense's openness to their participation in their planning process, but also SCRS needs much more empowerment to run an interagency planning process as they are chartered to do, for post-conflict and stabilization issues. But the idea is that you will have, if you follow the model they are attempting to put in place, a standing civilian response capability of U.S. government employees, and then 2 tiers beyond that, the last of which is the Civilian Reserve Corps, which I think most people have heard because it was in the President's State of the Union address, that is calling upon, it's a reserve model like the military has. It calls upon folks in everyday life who have skill sets to provide, to be pulled into service when we have more time. But inherent in that whole model is planning well before you're actually in a contingency for how you're going to use these forces. And under the Clinton administration, there was a process known as PDD 56, which was both a directive, and then it directed a process for how one plans in peacetime for these events. There is a follow-on NSPD in this administration for the same thing, and I think inevitably what you really need to move to is that sort of standing peacetime, if you will, process of planning.
I would just like to follow up on that. I absolutely, totally agree with everything Kathy has said. I would make a couple of other observations. One about PDD 56, which a lot of folks are looking to as a model, and it is an interesting document. It was written, though, for peacekeeping operations. It was, at the time it was the Balkans, it was Kosovo, Haiti, and the introduction to the PDD 56 actually talks about it wasn't intended to apply to armed conflict. Again, I draw a sharp distinction with between a peacekeeping operation and a war zone, where the U.S. is itself a belligerent. I think that requires a different level of planning. But as Kathy said, SCRS is working on this issue. I would actually like to see it go maybe even a little bit further, and I wanted to follow up on something that you started with. The civilians, I believe, do need to be involved in the planning, and it needs to be steady state. Again, I think this is something that needs to glom on to the military system that's already there. Civilians with the COCOMs, this sort of steady state, very top secret planning that is going on, that's when the civilian agencies need to get involved.
Yeah, one thing that I've thought about was...
Charles, your time has expired. Let's go to Mr. Lopsack, then we'll go around again. Okay. If we can do that. Okay. Mr. Lopsack.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be very brief. I just have a couple basic questions. And I missed the... I apologize for being late and missing some of the testimony. But in particular, I guess I just want to ask General Olson, your testimony, you mentioned that on page 6, the establishment of a set of measures that reflect true outcomes, that is the actual impacts that PRT operations have had on achieving larger coalition objectives, has been an elusive goal. I'm new to the Congress. I hear a lot about, I'm a former educator, right? I taught at a small college in Iowa. Heard a lot, my wife taught second grade, heard a lot about outcomes-based education. I hear a lot about accountability. Heard about that before I got to this office. I've heard a lot about it since I've been here. I've been to Iraq a couple of times. I'm very concerned about measures. The military has developed certain kinds of measures, obviously, to sort of indicate to us that as a result of surge, we've seen significant decline in violence in Iraq. I get very frustrated when I read something like this because I really want something that I can sort of wrap my head around as far as what these PRTs are accomplishing, if anything, especially in Iraq. Right. And I think when I came, I think that there was reference to the, sort of economic development, political development, military success, and all the rest. And I remember when I first got here, we had in the Armed Services Committee, the large committee, we heard from a number of our military folks about sort of the three-legged stool, and maybe that's what was being referenced when I came in, I don't know. Economic development is hugely important, obviously. Can you talk to us about any other sort of more concrete measures, if there are any, because you have a few examples here of successes, but it's kind of loosey-goosey for me in some ways. Sorry about the slang.
I'll use an educational metaphor, Congressman. You can measure the number of hours that a student studies, input measures, and make some determinations about how conscientious a student she is. You can measure how that student does on tests, the grade or the score that they get on an exam. That is an output measure. But how do you really measure whether or not that student is becoming a better person, better mathematician, a better political scientist? Grades won't do it for you. And so I'd turn that question back to you. I'd be interested in talking about how you did that. What I will say is this. We have wrestled really hard with PRT measures that really mean something.
Right.
And so good governance, let's take that as an example. In Iraq, we have in fact reported the number of government officials at local levels that we have trained.
Right.
I'm not so sure that that's all that good. Then we went to output measures. How many successful council meetings did they hold in a given period of time? An output measure, again, very problematic from a lot of standpoints. But then we went to things like, asking the question, what do good governments really do? Can they execute a budget?
Right.
Can they pass laws? Can they stand up entities that we would consider to be associated with, a good local government? And we try to capture those. And I'll tell you that there are some problems with doing that, as I'm sure you're well aware. There's a causality issue. Right. Does the fact that they can execute a budget, is that directly related to anything that the PRT did? Right. Or was there some other factor that's involved? So I would say, I would stand on my statement that it's still an elusive goal, but I will tell you it's getting better and better. Now, last thing I'll say on that is one of the measures I used was getting out there and seeing what was going on and talking to Iraqis in the streets and saying, how do you feel about your local government? They doing better? They doing worse? Right. And the other thing I did is talk to local military commanders. And you can think what you want about this measure, but the military commanders, 201, are impressed with and very much rely upon their PRTs in their overall effort.
Okay. I appreciate that, and I realize that there's nothing systematic that's going to come from this anytime soon in all likelihood, but I get very concerned about sort of anecdotal evidence and then using that one way or another in what still is political argument about whether we ought to stay in Iraq and for how long and all the rest. And so it's just a concern I have, and thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Lopezak. We'll go a second round if you got the endurance for it. I want to ask Ms. Hicks direct this question to you because you say we need to flat out, both the Congress and the executive need to elevate the priority attached to development, placing it on equal footing with defense and diplomacy in U.S. foreign and national security policy. And I agree with that. What I find, I guess, frustrating right now, if you ask probably about everyone that's in the Congress, well, what do you think is one of the top 1, 2, or 3 issues? It would be immigration, the concerns of the American people. In the view of a lot of people, that issue will never be solved for this country until Latin and Central America are economically developed. That as long as we have this incredible economic engine up here, it is going to draw in people who want to support their families and do well. So you would think that kind of development issue would be part of our answer to immigration, but I think Americans have gotten pretty frustrated through the years, maybe not justifiably so, with the impact that U.S. development dollars have on other countries. But I'll ask you one specific question. You can comment on that if you want. I've gone back and forth about whether I think that the answer to this interagency deal is like one big Goldwater-Nichols type process that you hear talk about, or more just a series of legislative actions, executive actions that really are more in the spirit of nudgings in different bills kind of on down this road, and that recognizes perhaps this is not one big magic bill that's going to come up and solve our problems. Where do you come down on that, given that you make some very specific proposals that would indeed take both legislative and executive action?
I hope you'll indulge me answering both those, because I just returned from Southcom last week, and
Maybe it's just my ears, Ms. Hicks, but your microphone seems a little more faint than the rest.
I'll speak up.
Thank you, yeah.
I just returned last week from Southcom, and as you probably know, they're undergoing sort of a transition there under Admiral Stavridis and trying to really raise the profile both of Latin America, but also of the sort of the mixed smart power, hard and soft power approach that the military is attempting down there. And they are explicitly actually attempting to tie the issue of immigration. So I would just encourage you to speak a little bit to them about how they are thinking about the importance of development and creating, non-corrupt, non-gang-ridden, sustainable societies, not as a military instrument alone, but as part of a whole approach from the U.S. government, and how they think that they can sell that, if you will, because of the immigration links. So I think you're really on to something there. On your second question, I think, as I tend to think, I was trained as a strategist in the Department of Defense, and I tend to think in a systems level. And as a systems kind of person, I prefer to think of it as, putting all the solutions set out there together and understanding the whole concept. I think there's a lot of value in that. Having said that, I think the reality is that you have to make progress piece by piece sometimes, but I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I actually think they're mutually supporting. I think in the environment we are in today, where we don't have broad-based support for interagency reform, or at least there doesn't appear to be, where we can make change, we should. There are small, specific changes we can make that are important, particularly the executive branch about its business, if you will, and the Congress about its business. I think good leadership on both sides can lead to internal reforms that really help. Having said that, I do think at some point there is going to need to be a holistic look at the national security process, at the structure we have, at how we train our people, and how we populate our organs of government. And that change is coming. It's just a matter of when there's openness to it.
Do you have any suggestions on how that holistic look might come about? I mean,
well,
we are one Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, and I think we're the only game in town right now in terms of the legislative side of things that's looking at this in any systematic way.
I belong to an organization that has done several such looks through the Beyond Goldwater-Nichols effort, and I won't talk more on those. I'm also part of what I think some of you are familiar with, the Project on National Security Reform, which is seeking to gain funds to do just such an approach. And we're divided into 7 working groups that look across issues of resource. I lead Process, the Process group, really looking at strategy, planning, and budget, strategy and planning across the interagency. There are groups who are looking at the structural elements and so forth. Groups that are within that who might look at Congress and see how Congress might play into this. That effort, again, it's waiting for funding. It was funded in the appropriations bill, so we're waiting to see if it was funded on the defense appropriations, so we're waiting to see if the Department of Defense picks that up. But I think some of the reluctance, again, is that it's all coming on the defense side. It's the defense community that's been interested. It's defense who would have to fund it, and there just doesn't seem to be the same groundswell. There is in the intelligence world, and there is to some extent in the Homeland Security world, but not in the state and AID world.
Mr. Reagan for 5 minutes.
Could you speculate as to why there isn't the interest or support in the state particularly? If I had to point to places where I would do things differently, having been in Congress now 7 years and taking a look at what's happened in Iraq particularly, I think probably I would want to change things in state more so than things that the military did per se. Why is it that the state doesn't have an interest in that?
Well, first, I wouldn't say that all of state doesn't have an interest, but I do not think there is, again, what I would call a groundswell of support from the bottom up.
Partly because they're just not engaged or involved and don't see the need as obviously as defense does. I mean, defense has to live with it every day. States got their own little, they've got all these different places in different countries, and they go there for a couple of years, and then they go to another one. They're not seeing what's happening. Is it that?
No, I am really speculating, but I will give you my thoughts on that. Part of it is that they're very beleaguered. They're small and they're underfunded, and when people say you need to change, you know, they take that as not, you need to change in the sense that we're going to resource you more. They take it as, oh, great, one more complaint about how we're doing not enough with too little. So I think that's part of the issue. I also think there is a basic cultural difference. I think the Defense Department, and actually PRTs are in some ways a good example of this. The culture of the military, as I have observed it over my time at DOD, is to have a very can-do attitude. If there's a vacuum, they're going to fill that. They're going to try to fill that vacuum, whether they're the best instrument or not. Even knowing when they're not the best instrument, they know that there's a void and it has to be filled. So that's a very leaning forward attitude, very can-do attitude. So I think the same thing is what you're seeing with DOD on the interagency piece. And Secretary Gates' recent speech was a good example of this. Things are broken. We need to fix it. And that's the military way. My observations on the State Department side are more cautious. They're just trained differently. They're trained to find the right tool for the right job. They need to define what the problem is and then fix the problem. And that's a very different and more cautious approach that takes longer to get to the solution set.
Anybody else want to speculate?
I'd like to offer just a few thoughts. I agree absolutely with everything Kathy said, and many of us are looking at these issues. I wrote a case study at NDU on the formation of SCRS and sort of all the internal problems and bureaucratic issues that arose within state and within other agencies. There was contention with AID as well. I agree with Kathy. It's largely an issue of agency culture. It's how they think, what their core missions are. In some ways, it's almost an odd thing to ask a diplomat who is trained to do conflict prevention and to negotiate and to prevent problems from occurring, to plan for post-war stabilization. Obviously, if war or conflict breaks out and you're a diplomat, something has gone horribly wrong, and it's just sort of contrary to the way they think. So I think you have to sort of overcome that cultural barrier first.
Just to add one point, state definitely is not an operational agency. You know, they report on what exists, but they really don't try and get down at the provincial or district level and do much about it in X country. But I do think, though, as the ambassador being the president's direct representative in country X, that one of the better ways to move forward is to strengthen his country teams, strengthen the MAG, strengthen the mission, so he has more wherewithal to work in the country. Then that feeds back into the government as a better assessment of what's needed. In my sense, if you have to deploy conventional forces into country X, then the ambassador and his country team has failed.
I didn't hear any of you say the thing that first springs to my mind, but maybe it's just looking at it more from a political point of view. I think of State Department as always a bunch of commies that were working in Foggy Bottom and everything, and I don't trust them too much. And I have a little bit more confidence in the military; they'll go solve the problem. And I'm drawing a caricature to a certain degree, but I'm just wondering whether or not the sense that state sort of perspective and what we should even do in a country may be different than what we're talking about. So it may be beyond a culture; it's almost a political mindset as to.
It's interesting, just based on my recent experience, the younger Foreign Service officers that are coming to the field, going to what General Warner said, they have that operational mindset and they jump into these missions because they believe in them. Mm-hmm. Some of the more senior Foreign Service officers keep this whole business a little bit more at arm's length. I don't think it's because they're not patriots or they don't agree with the mission. I think it's a combination of what everybody said here. They see their role differently. Plus, they have not been. They have come up through a system, a professional development system, an education system.
Does not encourage that.
Exactly. Yeah. It's focused on diplomacy. It's not focused on stability and security operations.
On the other hand, if you look at Vietnam, you have Ambassador Holbrook, Ambassador McManaway, Ambassador Wisner. There are about 8 or 9 ambassadors, either currently serving or recently serving, who were FSOs 6s and 7s in the mid-60s, the beginning of the 70s, performing in an operational capacity and running cords for Ambassador Porter. So it is possible.
just want to add one very concrete thing, which is in the military you have a practice of doing lessons learned, after action reports. You have a self-reflective professional development approach where you come out of the service periods of time when you're an officer, spend some time at a think tank or at a war college. And that has a big impact in how reflective the military is on its own need to adapt. It makes it, as much as we all decry the lack of adaptation sometimes, relative to other agencies of government, it's much more adaptive. You don't have a parallel like that for state.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mrs. Davis for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And maybe we could just continue this conversation. I was watching the general, and it looked like you wanted to say a few things in response to the State Department role as well. And, you know, perhaps, I mean, part of the problem is that there is a bias against soft power, I think. I mean, I heard someone say it should be smart power, not soft power. But that there is kind of that built-in bias, and yet, at the same time, it seems like so much of what we anticipate of our role in the world is based on that effort. And I don't know, is that a correct assumption? I mean, because I'm hearing that even among our NATO friends, that they think they don't do civilian very well either. You know, that somehow we all have to try and find a better way to use this capacity, which I think we have. We just haven't utilized it very well. We kind of take everything seems to be, at least from here, we see it as much more DoD-centric than probably, I hope that we might see that in the future. Could you comment on that? I mean, is that?
Well, I think you've already identified it. The Army, the Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, they'll fill the gap. They'll do the job, whatever it is. Even though they may be a volunteer service and the sergeants didn't really volunteer to come in and figure out how to move trash. They want to defend their country. That's the reason they're there. If they're told to figure out a plan in Baghdad to get rid of trash, they'll do it, and they'll do it as well as anybody in the world. But whether you have a big enough Army, and whether you can continue to get people to re-enlist for that, and whether they're the right structure to do that, that's a completely different issue. And my feeling is that the soft power or smart power really needs to be shaken a bit to pick up that mission, take that pressure off the armed forces who really have too few to do the missions they have now, and do it well, but from another agency, another approach.
You suggest a Department of Stability in your comments.
If you have to get the mid-level people out from other careworn bureaucracies in order to permit them to do a job they know how to will do, then create another bureaucracy. Not necessarily another Homeland Defense. I don't think that mixture is good enough. But I don't think we're talking about that many people that have to come from the various agencies or expand aid as the operational arm of the State Department to be able to do development as we're talking about. It doesn't take that much. Mm-hmm. But it does take somebody at the top to drive it.
Yeah. One of the questions I think we've asked a few times in this committee is, where do some of these individuals come from? And I think part of the answer has been, well, you know, they're really out there. Yeah. And it's just a matter of trying to, I think, provide the opportunities perhaps in some cases, but at least build something that's sustaining. And it seems to me that one of the things that we haven't discussed very well, partly because it's a long-term solution, is how you incentivize young people in school to think about going into a field which maybe they don't think State Department, they also aren't thinking military, but they maybe would think along Peace Corps lines or something. Right. And we haven't done that. I'm just wondering, what is there? Is it the Peace Corps model that you think is a good one? What model out there that we've utilized or internationally has been utilized that we ought to be thinking about it well in a long-term way?
It's a difficult issue, and many of us have been grappling with this. I think most of us would agree it's largely, it's a problem of core mission. You know, when you look at stability operations, and it doesn't belong to anyone. And in my more cynical moments, I would say that no one really wants it either when you go around all of the agencies, and that's a problem. And it hasn't been given. It hasn't necessarily been put on anyone's plate. The military gets stuck with it, as General Zinni has said. You know, we've become the stuckee, but it doesn't mean that they actually want to do it. I think that there is a lot of movement afoot right now, as Kathy was saying and General Olson was saying. The President has signed a National Security Professional Development executive order, and this idea sort of that you would develop a cadre in all of the agencies who would specialize in national security issues. And, maybe it's going to be post-war stabilization, maybe it will be a Katrina-type event, but where you need the Department of Transportation, you need Commerce, you need Justice, you need Labor to get involved. Mr. Chairman, you were asking earlier, what is Congress's role? Many of us have talked to Jim Locker, who was involved at the time of Goldwater Nichols 1. It's, and that was complicated enough dealing with just one congressional committee, or two in both houses. To do sort of a Goldwater Nichols 2 might involve as many as 6 or 8 committees. But I think at the margins, we don't necessarily need to change that much. If you could create some, and I don't know what the percentage is, maybe it's 2%, maybe it's 3%, but if all of the agencies and if all of the congressional committees could mandate that all of the domestic what I call the domestic agencies, the Commerces and Justices out there, as opposed to the foreign ops agencies, to have some kind of a national security focus such that when there is an emergency, when an Iraq comes along, when an Afghanistan comes along, Commerce, Justice, and Treasury and Labor has some small contingency, and maybe it's only 100 people who have been specially trained, they've exercised with the military. That is their job. You can't convert USDA into a foreign agriculture development organization. Obviously, you can't do that, but you can take small portions of it and have them specialize in agricultural development and overseas contingencies.
If I could just, there really are 2 models. The one is the one the chairman mentioned about nudging various legislative pushes. That is certainly one of the models, one of the courses of action. The other is very much along the lines of what Bernie was talking about. I think the need is recognized. I think the basic requirement is what gave rise to this war czar concept. Now, there's all sorts of, that's evolved as it has for lots of reasons, but there was a recognition that somebody needed to be in charge when it came to integrating the civilian and the military effort. Now, the problem with the war czar, it's an ad hoc. He is not empowered. He's a great guy, great military professional, but he cannot make these things happen. Now, I think there are models, governmental models of standing organizations that can kind of care for the integration of civilian and military effort on a continuing basis. And that's what it's going to take, because it is going to take doctrine. It is going to take education. It is going to take training. And that we can't just all of a sudden do that when a crisis breaks out. So the other model is a standing organization, and there are, you all are more familiar than I am with what they are, but there are models that integrate a multi-departmental effort in other areas that could serve perhaps as a model.
The only thing I would add is we've sort of evolved a little bit in answering the question, but I want to stay on the line we're on, which is if you look at the problems the United States faces as it moves in the future, it's not just stabilization. They're all complex. Almost all of them are multi-agency. We're not going to be able, we can pick and choose particular issues that are so important that we're going to create an organization, a standing structure to deal with them. And that's fine. But what we really need overall is to have a different approach to our problem sets. We have to understand that organizations need to be working across them, that we need to have more horizontal integration approaches. NCTC is one example that really, I believe, was not empowered effectively to do what it was asked to do. But if empowered appropriately, if able to go above and beyond what the cabinet agencies can do independently and really break that sort of what becomes a resource budget lock that the cabinet secretaries have, then you start to see, well, maybe there are ways to get into that interagency space and empower individuals and organizations or collective units of people to look at prioritization across basic mission areas. And it is very much along the lines of what DoD is looking at internally in terms of capabilities, portfolios, for instance. A whole sort of, you think about that interagency-wide, a portfolio approach to how we look at national security would be very useful.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. The issue of the, I forget who I was talking to, it may have been Mr. Armitage, that we were having a conversation about some of these issues, and he said it's just real hard from the State Department side. If the word goes out, they need 200 people, and they've got to have these specialties, and it means when you're pulling them, you're leaving work undone in Uzbekistan and Bulgaria, wherever it is that you're working. And I suspect if we would take what you say, Ms. Hicks, and General Warner said, and others are saying about the pretty dramatically under-resourcing of the State Department, and do a little bit of a carrot and a stick, which is we were going to recognize that and do a fairly dramatic increase in budget, which will reflect staffing. But as part of that, there's got to be a sense of some of these people are going to be a bit redundant, and they will be available. Don't be surprised if one of your 2 ag people gets pulled to go someplace else. But I would think that it's really hard to do right now when they're under-resourced. I wanted to ask two final questions, and if Ms. Davis has any final questions. The first one, Ms. Hicks, on your upcoming task force report, you talk about your 4 main recommendations, and we've talked, I think, about one of them is the issue of development. So it's the other 3 I wanted to at least touch on. This issue of an NSC Senior Director for Conflict Prevention and Response to serve as the locus of interagency coordination on these issues in the White House. And then, but you also talk about the importance of having better congressional oversight and following. It is hard for us in the Congress to do oversight of NSC. They're not required to testify. They're presidential advisors. If that's where the game's going to be, we might as well just say, let's put money into a black box. We don't ever see it until we evaluate years after what happened to it. I don't see how that's going to work in terms of practice. Why are we choosing somebody within the NSC? Now, in defense of that approach, I talked to one former Secretary of State about this whole issue a few months ago, who said, we don't need to do interagency reform. It's supposed to be the NSC. They just need to do their job. If they would recognize that that's what they should, that they're the ones that should be putting all this together. So would you respond to how is that going to work when in fact it will not be something that we will have any impact on?
Right. The thought there is that if you have, basically it takes what is SCRS's, sort of mandate now, and moves it up to the National Security Council level to give it higher visibility, to have, to the extent that the president endows that senior director with his confidence or her confidence and trust, it gives that person an ability to look all the way across the interagency and, as you say, act, or as you quoted, act as the NSC ought to act. But that does not mean that you lose oversight of what it is seeing. All it says is that the executive branch's activities need to be coordinated. And to coordinate that, that's the role of the NSC, and it ought to be elevated to an NSC position. The individual pieces that support that and how they're put together is still absolutely under the oversight of the Congress. It's under the oversight of various jurisdictions.
But doesn't that, I mean, just looking ahead, doesn't that put us, if I understand what your suggestion is going to be, and I recognize this is one about 3 sentences on what I suspect will be a fairly lengthy discussion, doesn't it put the Congress in a position of saying, well, we've got the person from the State Department sitting here, and I got the person from the DOD sitting here, and we've got a problem in country why you all are not coordinating, and they both say, well, we did our part. We did what the NSC asked us to do, and we don't hear from NSC. I don't know where the buck's got to stop somewhere. Maybe we say it stops with the president. That's how it operates. But I was thinking we would end up with some kind of a body that we have more that there's a trail that we can follow. You talk about having this the big joint committee or some kind of select committee on U.S. national security, but we can create all the committees we want to. If we can't get at the person that you would designate as being ultimately responsible to have to to be held accountable for decisions within that interagency process, I'm not sure we're going to accomplish what you're hoping to accomplish by these changes.
I think the more radical approach, again, is the NCTC model. If you wanted to, right, you could create an organization that sits in the interagency space and that has authority over the various cabinet agencies to coordinate and to prioritize, if you will, budgets. It's sort of the drug czar approach, but taken to an organizational level and placed outside of the White House. And that is, I think that is a more radical solution you could look at. The problem is getting it set up appropriately so that other agencies do recognize it. The fact of the matter is today, in the system in which we operate, there's only one organization that the foreign policy communities even sort of recognize as perhaps above them, and that is the White House. And the fact of the matter is that's the National Security Council. So it has to come, it has to be the National Security Council, again, not just stabilization, but across all areas that's trying to coordinate and bring these issues together.
But my concerns are not off the mark about that.
No, the fact of the matter is if you wanted to call witnesses, you're right, you would get the rep from the Defense Department and the rep from the State Department. You would not get that one view, and they would just tell you what they're supplying
their
upward.
pieces, yeah.
Right.
I wanted to, my final question is, very quickly, the one piece that's sitting out there of potential, that potentially addresses some of these concerns is the President's proposal for a civilian reserve corps. The money's been appropriated. The legislation hasn't been moving yet. But would you each quickly talk about what you think about that proposal and where it fits in, and do we need to move ahead with it in an expeditious way? Want to start, Ms. Hicks?
I strongly support it. I think the Congress needs to move forward in an expeditious way, and frankly, it's not a one-shot issue. That there's going to be a need to grow that capacity beyond what's been requested for this tranche over time.
I support it too, and it's based on experience when we went to expand the so-called civilian surge, expand the PRTs and the number of people serving there. We were looking for people with specific specialties, and there's no data bank we could really go to for, who was an expert in this particular area. We were lucky to get Sharon when she came in and, as an agricultural expert on veterinary affairs. But if there were some kind of system, as you just described, I think it would be much easier to get the right type of capabilities to match requirements.
General Warner?
Well, if you don't do it, civilian contractors will probably fill it.
Mr. Carreau?
Yes, I support it as well, with the caveat that I think it's almost more important to get sort of the interagency element of government up and running first to make sure you have proper oversight so that you don't end up with a Blackwater type situation where you have contractors running amok.
And then that presents a question of what does that mean to have an interagency up and running, and that could be some years down the line. I don't think we want to wait that long on doing something. Mrs. Davis, you want to, anything further?
Yeah, just to follow up with this, because, it's an idea that's out there, it's expensive, and, maybe people think that it's pie in the sky a bit, but something like the Civilian Corps Academy, to mirror our military academies, where you have young people, again, who study and plan and do the kind of strategic thinking, hopefully, that we have in the military academies, and some sharing that goes on. So some of those folks eventually will take on a major responsibility in thinking about these things. Is that part of discussion? Is that sort of, wow, we'll never get there, or do you think that that's realistic?
The military academies.
Or not necessary, I guess. Yeah.
Military academies are focused on pre-commissioning development, whereas your idea has excellent applicability further on down the line. Right now, the Army runs the School of Advanced Military Studies. The Marines have an equivalent that they call SAWS. And as a matter of fact, USAID, for the first time, has a student at the School of Advanced Military Studies, and that is where the Army, anyway, learns how to think strategically and do strategic planning. And now this USAID official is going to be able to go to an operation, let's say, and plug in very comfortably with a military planning team, whereas right now, military planning teams stand up. Officials from civilian agencies go there, and they're completely lost. They don't understand the processes. They don't think strategically about operations like the military guys do. So I think your idea is right on the mark. I would say bump it up a level in terms of where these officials are in their careers. And I think you've got a great idea there.
Ms. Hicks?
I would just add there is this concept of the National Security University, which is more along the lines of what Rick is pointing to. And the thought there is that she would bring together sort of maybe in brick and mortar, but also sort of in a virtual sense, a consortium of institutions where individuals, whether it's the Fire Academy in Emmitsburg for DHS, or it's the Foreign Service Institute for State, or it's the National Defense University, you have these centers of excellence that can teach these bodies, folks coming from all across the interagency, a common skill set and at the same time a diverse set of issues.
Yeah, appreciate that. I'm trying to get him a little younger, I guess. But just one other quick question about the asymmetry between civilian and military, Ms. Hicks, especially that you have spoken to, and again, what can Congress be doing? I get seeing that as really it's a budgetary role. It's how you share those resources. How do you? Any suggestion?
Well, I think, again, it is essentially at its core a cultural and then resource issue. And I do think you can make the resource the leading edge of the change. So if you can increase the float, so to speak, for the Foreign Service and for the Foreign Service that are serving out of USAID, that helps tremendously in terms of their ability to support operations and then also to go get trained, to go down and be at the war colleges or other institutions or even FSI. So I think that the resourcing piece of it is really just bumping up their total personnel, making sure they have funds for adequate training, and then starting to think, having those organizations be tasked to think strategically about how they're going to, now that they have these things or as they're going to get these resources, how they're going to think strategically about employing them.
Can I take 30 seconds on that? I think it was the chairman that said it's hard to put resources against something where there's no real model yet. And I think we need to have the model. I think the model needs to be on the table. I think also one of the members said that there's a lot of energy being put into looking at this problem. CSIS is doing it, and there are other think tanks and governmental agencies out there. I think, and I'm not sure exactly the mechanism, but if there were a way to tie these all together, I think we could come up with something pretty good for Congress to consider. And I'm not proposing another commission or anything exciting like that, but I think there are ways for Congress to work to force, let's say, a more collaborative effort here. I think organizations would be interested in doing that if there was something to kind of coalesce around. And right now there isn't. Everybody's kind of moving in different directions, looking at different pieces of it, but it's stitching all the different pieces together that I think could really help the overall effort.
I'd like to add just a couple of comments. I totally agree with what my colleagues have said. I spent the first year at the Pentagon trying to organize the civilian agencies to send folks to Baghdad, and it was one of the most frustrating years of my life. I think that one of the things I think the Congress can do, the agencies don't respond because it's not their core mission, and they really have no reason to. They're not being graded on it. There's no accountability, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman. And I think one thing that Congress could do is give them that accountability, give them a modest mandate or authorization to care about these stability activities. USDA, the Foreign Agricultural Service, their mission in life is to sell U.S. soybeans and corn, and God bless them for it. That's a national interest that we want to do. But there comes a time when we're going to need agricultural experts to help out in Kosovo and in Afghanistan. Same with the Foreign Commercial Service at Commerce. They are to promote U.S. exports, but there will be a time when they need to help out to do business development and private sector development in Iraq. And until they have that mandate, and until someone is put on the hot seat, someone at the Commerce Department, and asked, what are you doing to support the effort in Iraq as you were mandated to do, you won't find that kind of an effort.
Thank you all very much. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Thank you all for being here. Let me just extend you have an open-ended invitation as to submit any additional materials as a question for the record right now. So if you think of something you think would be helpful, please feel free to send it in. We appreciate your all service, and we appreciate your thoughts. Ms. Hicks, we look forward to your report. We hope we're one of the first on your list to receive it when it's done. Thank you all. The committee is adjourned.